and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. This is the full Scottish review of the year. I am Martyn Day, and I'm joined today in the studio with William Duguid. Thank you for being here, William.
Hello.
And online with Hugh Marshall. Thank you, Hugh.
Hello, how are you?
Not bad. We've got a fair bit to think over 2024, so we'll press on. And the big story of the year, I think, was the UK general election. Speculated to take place in November, but actually took place at the beginning of July, which caught many of us by surprise. What can we say? The first Labour government in a generation, the largest number of new MPs in parliamentary history. A majority of Westminster MPs have been elected for the first time. And the rest, as they say, is history in the making. Hugh, would you like to give us a perspective from Wales on what happened at the general election?
Yeah, I think it was, I think generally Labour's sort of victory, and it was like a victory despite of Keir Starmer. I think it's quite clear after the result that we saw support for Labour didn't really grow from the last general election, and it was Reform taking votes away from the Conservatives that handed them the huge majority they got. Plaid Cymru performed better than expected here in Wales. There were, there were seats where Labour literally threw the kitchen sink at it, and they failed to take those seats. But what was disappointing here was the level of support for Reform. They came second in a couple of seats. And, with a bit more wind in their sails, they could have actually taken a couple of seats in Wales.
Yes, no, thanks for that.
We're a complete Tory-free zone now, that's the other thing.
Well, there are obviously some things to be grateful for. I think the interesting point on the Tory vote is that if you combined it with the Reform vote across the UK, they would have outpolled Labour, which says how weak the Labour majority actually is, despite the fact that they won a record 411 seats to the Tories' 121. The difference in terms of shares of the vote for the right versus the centre-left are somewhat different. William, what's your thoughts on the...
Well, it's a classic illustration of the first past the post system's slightly weird results. That certainly was responsible for the size of the Labour majority, which was not based on a percentage anything like the last time they had such a majority. It also explains why Reform, despite getting 14% of the vote in England, only got 5 seats. They were 7% in Scotland, and like you, that was an interesting feature. I was sitting here as part of the Broadcasting Scotland election special with Linda Fabiani, and every so often a piece of paper would come into the room and sort of come round the desk with the latest result, and always Reform, even in Scotland, would always have 2,500 to 3,500 votes, and that for me was particularly interesting. The other side of the first past the post was, of course, the fact that despite the fact that the SNP weren't all that far behind Labour in Scotland, they only got 9 seats, and that was baked in from quite early on. The initial, I recall that the initial prediction was that they would have 10, but it was in the end only 9. And I think, Martyn, you may have some memories of that evening of
Yes.
your own. But it wasn't as seismic as 1997, and the aftermath has not been perhaps as triumphant either.
No. I certainly carry the scars from my own personal campaign from that election, and one of the things that stands out is the turnout was significantly down on 2019. 7.6% across the UK, similar in Scotland. And analysis certainly shows UK-wide, and this is definitely reflected in Scotland, that it was lower turnouts in the areas that Labour won. So you combine that risk of people that were disillusioned coming back out the next time. I think Starmer's government will have a big hurdle or two to overcome before you take on into account delivery or lack of delivery on policy pledges. So we've seen a fair change, although many of the public might feel that they've been shortchanged as a result of things that have came out of the election. They've not had, the government coming in has not had its problems to seek. The Tories didn't leave the UK in a very good position. It would be fair to say they probably stopped governing at the beginning of the previous year, and questionable as to how well they were governing prior to that anyway. So what have they actually done is, I suppose, the big question. They've upset a lot of people. William, would you like to?
Well, you said they didn't have their problems to seek. It seems to me they went in search of additional problems from the off. And one could argue that they have systematically cheesed off every sector of the population that might have supported them. They went for pensioners fairly early on with the
Came back for a second bite.
winter fuel payment. Yeah, and they've just come back for amazingly. Anybody who was still maybe marginally interested in supporting has got clobbered with the. Well, you can justify it economically, but maybe not if you have an economy where you run your own currency and actually you can print the 10 billion for justice and actually do as the ombudsman says. But really unprecedented to go against an ombudsman, but yep, the WASPy women aren't getting compensated. And one wonders whether Labour are actively trying to lose the next election, however far away it may be. So, there have been various other episodes, none of them particularly laudable at all. And you ask me, what have they done? I am struggling to think of anything very much, except tell us how bad everything is and why they effectively can't do anything about it for quite some time.
Oh, thanks, William. Hugh, would you like to make any comments on?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because obviously the dynamic between Wales and Scotland is interesting, because I think there was, at the general election, there was generally an anti-incumbent mood going around. So again, the Tories, it wasn't just 14 years of austerity. I think in the last 2 or 3 years they'd absolutely completely lost their way with Johnson and Truss, and then Sunak. It was it had become a bit of a fiasco. And I think in Scotland, again, even though it was a general election, and this is where I think just political education comes into play, that people were voting for people in Westminster to speak on their behalf. And whatever people think of the SNP in Holyrood, they were a very effective opposition at Westminster. But obviously, people voted in Labour, and now they're seeing what the promises that Labour were telling everybody, that everything will be great. Here in Wales, we've got Labour at both ends of the M4, which means everything's going to be fantastic and everything's going to be better. Prior to the election, Welsh Labour were demanding the 3.4 billion from the Barnett consequentials for HS2, which never came to Wales, and they were in agreement with that. Lo and behold, now that they're in power in Westminster, there are more important things to be getting on with. So I think Labour are going to really suffer, I think, at the next Senedd and Holyrood elections, which are coming up relatively shortly now in May 26, less than a year and a half away. But I think it's how Reform perform in that coming election, feeding off the resentment against Labour and the Conservatives. I don't know how long it'll take people to get over the fact that they were an unmitigated disaster, and their new leadership is very similar in style to the last couple of incumbents. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But my concern is that Labour's inaction and stubbornness and the lack of appeal of Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, both of them are very off-putting, I think, to the public. And I think, come 2016, I think Starmer's going to be in a really tough position with the local elections and the the devolved elections.
Oh, I think that's some very interesting insights, and having played my part as part of that SNP opposition at Westminster, I think one of the stark realities we have in politics, particularly in a governmental election, is people don't vote for an opposition. And while oppositions are essential to have good governance, that's not what people vote for. They vote for putting somebody into power. And unfortunately, we were traditionally squeezed in a way that we hadn't been for a number of years. So that takes us on to what comes next. And I suppose the first scandal to hit the new government was the scandal of political gifts and hospitality donations, largely around the donations of Lord Ali, a Labour peer, although from other sources as well. Indeed, Keir Starmer, I'm just checking the figure, since 2019 received £107,145 worth of gifts and hospitality, more than any other Labour leader combined since they'd lost office the time before, which is a staggering amount. So that certainly took a bit of shine off the administration. Any thoughts on that yourself, William?
Yeah, well, of course, it's all right, isn't it? Because they declare it all. At least it's supposed to be. But frankly, it's an outrageous way to be going about things. It looks as if they're just in it for the money, basically. And, you can't really clothe yourself properly for politics without going to shop at Lord Ali. And what on earth I'm the wrong generation to be saying this, but what on earth the appeal of Taylor Swift? Why so many politicians need expensive tickets to her concerts? I really do not know. And all of this at a time when people have voted these guys in because they've been struggling. They've been having a hard time of things. Inflation's been terrible. Energy costs are through the roof. They're struggling to make it from day to day through the winter. And suddenly these guys come along and are just getting it all presented to them on a plate. It's not a good look, and it doesn't build any sort of confidence in the government, and it pushes people into the arms of the next party that hasn't done that sort of thing to them. And the only ones left come the next election are likely to be Reform, and people will vote for them because they're not the establishment. They'll be different. But will they? Well, of course they won't, but that's the danger.
Yeah. You mentioned, of course, it was all declared, although what brought the story to light was largely the failure to declare in the correct timescale of the 10,000 donation to Lady Starmer.
Timing is nothing.
But it was eventually declared, and as a way to try and take some of the heat out of the story, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, paid back 6,000 of the 107,000 that he'd received in gifts and donations. So there we go. That clearly makes it okay. Do you have any thoughts on the whole expenses?
Yeah, I think
scandal? Something
that it feels like it was an age ago, but Vaughan Gething, who was First Minister following before and just following the general election, had to stand down because he had accepted £200,000 in donations towards his campaign to become First Minister from a convicted environmental business owner being found guilty of dumping waste illegally. And it was fascinating because, again, he'd followed the rules. He hadn't broken any rules. But again, it was this lack of sort of vision of what the public perceive of politicians, that they just seem to think that they can deflect these things. And I think that's one of the big issues with politics. And I think this is across all parties. I don't think any of them are free of this, is there's far too many people within political parties who are representatives at whatever level, who are too involved in the politics of the party. It's that their bubble is their own party and those discussions, and it means that they are in general, I think, out of touch with the general public. So I think that's something that people need to learn, and I think that's where Reform are saying we're not like them, and I think there is an issue. I think there's an issue with politicians being out of touch with the public. Keir Starmer why on earth would you allow somebody to buy your glasses? That's madness, especially when you're earning, a fortune. And I'm sure Keir Starmer, wasn't short of a bob or two before he became Prime Minister. So it's just this bizarre actions of accepting gifts from people and just thinking that it's normal and okay. You wouldn't do that in real life. So why do they think that they're different? And that this thing is, they're doing it. They don't expect anything in return. Nobody in this world gives somebody something without a reason.
Well, I think that's a very good point to make. What do the donors benefit from it? It's is it just altruism? Are they just being really nice to politicians who have a hard time, or do they get some form of benefit out of it? And it brings us on to looking at how political parties are indeed funded, because we've big in the news towards the end of the year was the potential donations from Elon Musk to reform, potentially talking about anything up to 100 million, which seems a bit excessive given that he didn't even donate as much as that to Donald Trump. So I suspect some of these numbers need taken with a pinch of salt, and as yet they've not given anything. But what does it mean for our democracy with the influence of foreign money coming in? And I've got a couple of quotes I'll just give you that I was looking at earlier on, if I can find them in my own notes. The Transparency International UK did a report which was published earlier this month, I should say, or earlier December, calling for an end to the arms race in spending and calling for lower limits, both in terms of individual candidate spending and in terms of donations. Quite a robust report suggesting caps of 10,000 per year from individuals or organisations. I personally think that's perfectly reasonable. However, when you look at the sizes of some donations that organisations have given to political parties, that would be way lower than has been given. And also the Electoral Commission Chief Executive, Vijay Rangarjan, has said that the system needs strengthening. So there seems to be an acceptance that there's something wrong. William, would you like to?
The mere fact that there's an acceptance that something's wrong doesn't necessarily mean that anything's going to be done about
No.
it. It has to be said that the initial reaction of the Labour Party to the suggestion that they do something about the potential pollution of the system by a huge Elon Musk donation to reform, making that kind of thing impossible, doesn't seem to be something they're very interested in, because they stand to benefit from big donations over time as well. It's more than reasonable to cut the amount of expenditure that's allowed within a campaign. Obviously, you need to be able to run a proper campaign and to move people about the place. But as soon as you make the limits too high, then the ones who can make the most money are the ones that do better. And if in a proper democracy, the playing field needs to be as level as it can be. But right now, I see no. It's early days, but I see no particular impetus towards it. I do recall, though, that just 15 years ago there was the MP's expenses scandal, and after a concerted campaign, notably of all people by the Daily Telegraph, goodness me, things did change, but obviously not that much if you can still get your glasses from shop at Lord Alley. But it may be that public pressure might produce some sort of change in the attitude from Labour, or maybe they're just waiting for Christmas to pass and people forgetting about it would be another thing.
Well, I'll bring Hugh in here, but before I do, a figure that I have to say I don't know is a guy called Doug Chalmers, who's the UK government's Committee on Standards in Private and Public Life, and he has suggested that caps should be put on political donations, that they shouldn't exceed net profits after tax in the 2 previous years, which is an interesting suggestion. However, in the case of Elon Musk's firms, would mean that he could still give 100 million because his companies have made more than that. So it sounds like smoke and mirrors, perhaps. It
sounded a bit like football financial fair play until you said that last bit.
Yeah. Hugh, would you like to make any comments on the political fundings?
Well, I'm an Everton supporter, so I understand the pain of financial fair play. and unfortunately, yeah, I think it does raise the question about party political funding and whether it should, come from public funds. So that there is a pot, and it comes out of that. We know, the Conservatives rely on very rich donors. Many of them switch from one party to another. We had people switching from Conservatives to Reform, from Conservatives to Labour, because again, they're looking at what that party will do for them personally from a financial perspective. So it's clear that that there is sort of a link between donating and hoping to sort of have sort of political favours that are going to benefit people. I think it was very interesting that Richard Tice, who was very animated a couple of years ago about the potential of people from outside the UK donating money to Labour, who now apparently is all in favour of foreign entities funding political parties. A coincidence or what? I don't know. But just the fact that Elon Musk is becoming this I don't know, malign influence in global politics. And I think what's going to be interesting is I can't see Donald Trump continuing to play second fiddle to Elon Musk. I'd imagine Elon Musk, just by looking at his sort of personality, is a type of person who, wants to sort of be in control and will take decisions without conferring with other people. And it's only a matter of time before the relationship between him and Trump goes south, and it's going to be very entertaining to watch that when it all collapses. But worryingly, where will that money go afterwards? Because Musk obviously is, looking to use his money to influence politics. Because as a South African, he obviously can't sort of stand in the United States as a politician himself.
I mean, one of the areas of concern for many years has been the influence of dark money that's completely opaque, and now it's reaching. Certainly, there's been enough reports to suggest it was instrumental in the Brexit referendum. We know that the Tory changes to overseas electors, which allowed pretty much anyone to register as an overseas elector with a fraction of the voter ID requirements that is now required in this country for somebody to vote in person, opens up the whole prospect of unincorporated associations funneling dark money in from overseas. An issue I've raised myself during my time in Parliament. Of course, it would be fair to say that the major British political parties weren't really interested in closing those loopholes, and which doesn't fill me with any confidence that we'll see much progress. But it certainly is an area that we should all be alert to. Money coming in from overseas, but also dark money from within our own country if it's funneled through unincorporated associations. Would you like to say anything, William?
I think democracy needs to be fixed, but I'm not sure how we go about it. Because, as you've just said, the main players, the big UK political parties, see enough of an advantage for themselves in the current situation. So they'll carry on. They might change their mind if an absolute shed load of money were poured into reform, who then hammered them in a UK election. But even that might not be sufficient. Labour doesn't seem to learn lessons very easily. And it always thinks it can come back, and sometimes it turns out to be right, as it did this year, although perhaps in particular circumstances. So, I mean, to be blunt, it's one of the reasons I would like to break away from the UK so we can actually start to do things differently in Scotland. I hope and pray that we would do things differently, although I think even then it requires a bit of a change in mindset, but at least we'd be in the starting gate. I'm sure the same is true of Wales as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think one of the issues we have in Wales is people, and I think people in general, are just seeing that devolution has failed, that it hasn't delivered the benefits for people that it was supposed to sort of deliver. it's frustrating because I don't think it is. I don't think devolution has failed. I think the fact that there haven't been enough powers, especially in Wales and also in Scotland, because if you haven't got the levers, from a financial perspective to change things, then basically you're just administering on behalf of the party who's in power at Westminster. And I think that's the disturbing element, is that that it's a threat to democracy, and I think that's what reform bring, is that threat of democracy. Although, interestingly, even though reform, in their DNA are anti sort of devolution and Welsh and Scottish independence, they see the fact that the Senedd and Holyrood elections are fought on proportional representation, and so they see them as huge potential for them to get into power. And I think that's where the concern is with people like Musk putting money into reform. It won't be for the general election in 5 years' time. Obviously, that'll be part of the plan, but it will be to try and get them, in positions of power in Wales and Scotland. And it's not the case of the messages that we'll see on social media. It's the messages that we won't see on social media, because we know from the Brexit campaigns how they effectively targeted individuals. So we didn't see those messages because we were in support of staying within the European Union. But the people who voted against it were bombarded with these misleading messages that were blaming all our woes on immigration.
I think you've hit on a very important point there, the real risk of micro-targeting, which is a danger for anyone that can pay for it. But when you then put organisations like X with Elon Musk at the head of that, and suddenly it's enabled, and in a frightening way. In the suggestions, I think it was at the Romanian presidential election, might have been swung by TikTok towards a pro.
A candidate who was purely on TikTok and just about nowhere else. Yes.
Yeah. So we need to be afraid, I think, is the lesson from that. I for years would tell people to check their sources. I think very few people do, which is the worrying thing.
Yes, this is the lack of critical thinking in the population, which I fear is an inevitability, but probably is something that could be taught better in schools. But nevertheless, if you live in a world where misinformation and disinformation is virtually universal, and it's difficult, it really is difficult to know which source to build on when you're trying to construct your view of the world. And it may be that as a species we haven't learned to live with the ubiquity of information yet in a way that helps us. In fact, it seems that we were doing better when we had limited information. So that's one of the ongoing problems with democracy, not just here, but everywhere, but certainly here.
I think you've hit a very important point. When in the days when it was just the old printed newspapers, you picked up a paper, you knew what the editorial bias was, and you could take that into context when you read an article. Whereas, who knows what's coming from us from social media. Would you like to add anything to that, Hugh, before we move on?
Just briefly. Interesting enough, I'm starting to study for a master's in January. In leadership and innovation in journalism is the programme that I'm doing with the University of Central Lancashire. But what I'm looking at is exactly that issue of what drove a plumber from Bolton to read something on Facebook, and then within 3 hours he was trying to set fire to a hostel where immigrants were being housed. Because I think the danger is we seem to think that the answer is to show people facts and give them facts on social media. That's not going to make any difference, because they are being influenced by people who are very clever at what they're doing. And we need to take a new approach, I think, to understanding politics. And I think exactly what you're saying about, it needs to be embedded in schools as part of education, but also I think we need to have things that are based within communities, so people can actually have face-to-face contact with, because there is a breakdown of trust with the media. We have this mainstream media, fake news, and it has been damaging The fact that traditional news organisations, newspaper circulations are just going down and down and down, and because of the business models, news websites now are carrying far less news and more just content to drive sort of page views. So it's a worrying time, and I think that there needs to be some investment in education and information and in independent news and information services.
Oh, I think and that's before we even get into things like deep fakes and
Oh my
AI technology.
which will get more and more sophisticated.
Mhm. Yeah. Indeed, I think that might be the one lesson that comes out of the 2024 elections worldwide is the initial use of deepfake technology. So hopefully as we go into future years, we'll have a much better idea of what is likely to happen and we can forewarn people in advance. As opposed to what is likely to happen, what has happened in the past, of course, is we've had over a century of promises of abolishing the House of Lords. And indeed, we had more promises before the election that it would be abolished and replaced with an elected chamber. And of course, what we have is an additional 38 Lords going in at the end of the year there. So are we surprised? I suppose perhaps not.
Just about everything Labour promised before the election has not come to pass. So in this league table of surprising U-turns, the House of Lords is not one of them. It fits the pattern for Labour. Why should they abolish the House of Lords when individually and potentially even collectively they stand to gain from it? And the same is true again. And we have some people that have at one point been roundly rejected by the electorate, and I'm thinking here of Wendy Alexander, who maybe she wasn't electorate, but Margaret Curran certainly was, and now they're Lords. Now they're her £361 a day, and whatever inflation does to that in future years. And they have a say. They have a say in what happens to us. And we didn't want them to have a say, or we would have expressed that view. So yes, it's not a surprise, and I'd like to see them challenged more on why yet another U-turn. Why is this good? And it's basically another form of corruption when you get round to it. If you kowtow to the party line in certain matters, if you say certain things, if you have the right attitudes to things, you will get your reward, and it will be for life, and nobody will be able to sack you. And in a sense, you can't blame people for reacting to that by doing just those things for that reward, because it's a pretty good deal, but it shouldn't be on the table.
Thank you for that, William. It should be said, of course, that Labour is removing the 92 hereditary peers that were there. Baroness Smith of Basildon, who is leader of the House of Lords, not a figure I know, said at the time of the second reading, the intention is crystal clear to end the hereditary element of the second chamber before embarking on further changes. Of course, since she said that, they've appointed the additional 38 peers. Hugh, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, again, I can see why Labour, puts that number in, because they're trying to balance up the numbers from when the Conservatives, sort of packed the benches with their own members. But as I say, it's we need a second chamber. I think it's a very important part of scrutiny. But again, I think it just shines a light on the archaic nature of, I think, English politics, particularly. This place, the other place, and the fact that they, still stick to these nonsensical, things of, you have to wear a tie, and it's just not moving on with the time. And I think a lot of, especially younger people, are just thinking this is madness. Why are they going out into a division lobby and walking through a lobby to vote when they could be doing it on a tablet or on a device? I think there's a need to modernise. I'm not that familiar with Holyrood, but I know in the Senedd, when it was set up as the Assembly, there was far too much copying of Westminster when it came to how they were going to organise themselves. And there was an opportunity there, not just to set up, a new form of, devolved government, but a new way of doing government. And I think one of the issues we have in Wales and Scotland is this doing things as Westminster, the mother of all parliaments, as if it's some sort of wonderful, sort of entity, when in fact it's, the fact that, they have so many holidays, you have difficulty keeping up with, when they actually get time to do stuff. And I think lots of stuff just take far too long because of the nature of Westminster and the House of Lords.
Yeah. There's been quite I suppose, a few stories around the Lords. There's been an FOI issue regarding the justification for new appointments, largely provoked by the resignation honours list from Boris Johnson and some of the individuals who were nominated. We can only speculate, and we wouldn't be appropriate to do so, as to why the younger members like Charlotte Owen or Ross Kempsell were appointed. But these things need justified if you're going to have a Lords, although better, if, in my opinion, if you didn't have a Lords at all. Other issues remain on the table as to why we still have unelected clerics in the House of Lords. The UK is the only country other than Iran to have such a situation. And of course, these unelected clerics are purely from the Anglican Church, which, given that nearly half the UK population is Christian and a minority of them are Anglican, it just seems very bizarre that is still the case in the 21st century. William?
If you were going to reform the House of Lords, that's one of the things you would fix first, not necessarily the hereditary peers. Strangely enough, sometimes the hereditary peers are the most even-handed because they don't pay court to political parties. But you need to reform the whole thing. And yes, we need a second chamber. We need an effective second chamber. But this isn't it. And it shouldn't be it. It's UK insisting on being Ruritania all the time. And that may be attractive for American tourists as they coo watching it all. And, oh, gosh. But no, not in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Do you have anything to add?
I'm just looking at, because again, it's just fascinating. I'm looking at the makeup of the House of Lords. 25 bishops, 185 Labour Party, 271 Conservatives, 78 Lib Dems, and then you got the DUP, UP, Green, Plaid, and 184 crossbenchers. And again, the fact that they don't get paid, but they do get that £360 a day daily allowance and expenses. And remember, it's tax-free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and that I think it's 801 sitting members and 24 non-sitting members. I presume that probably includes Baroness Clark in the Scottish Parliament, who's a non-sitting member. So there's certainly a few anomalies there that may get taken.
Is the First Minister of Wales a sitting member at the present, or is she not while she's First Minister?
No, so just First Minister. So ironically, Carwyn Jones, who was the First Minister before Mark Drakeford, he's been ennobled in the New Year's honours. But yes, no, sorry, you're right. She was a Lord, Eluned Morgan. So yes, because she had a very, she's been a professional politician, MEP, Lord, and then Senate member. Sorry.
It's quite a portfolio,
isn't it? There's a CV, which sort of leads me on to the other post that no one ever has to apply for, and that's the role of monarch, the head of the House of Lords in some respects. As they do have the right to sit there. Should we be a monarchy or a republic? Which is a question that's raised its head towards the end of the year, largely down to an opinion poll commissioned by Believe in Scotland, which showed 59% of Scots would support an independent Scotland if it was to be a republic, versus 54% if it wasn't to be a republic. which opens up a very interesting debate on a number of levels.
Yes, it's the same sample. It's the 54 and the 59, so it is a worthwhile comparison. I think in 2014, in that independence campaign, we were pretty much pussyfooting around the idea of the monarchy, because there's a lot of yes supporters that are actually quite in favour of the monarchy. I have to say, in the intervening years, I haven't met them particularly. Maybe one or two, I don't know, or maybe I misinterpreted a statement in a Zoom meeting once. But certainly, it's not a widespread view. That's the first thing. The second thing is that Scotland isn't as keen on the monarchy as England is, and that is shown every time there is a big royal event, be it an anniversary or even a death. And the way it's marked in Scotland is exceptionally low-key. The Queen's Diamond Jubilee. I think there was one wee dance school in Perth had some Union Jacks up. Nobody else much. And that's the way it's been for a long time back. So I think possibly also the monarchy is getting, or potentially getting, slightly less popular as various stories come out, but also in the fact that we no longer have Queen Elizabeth, who was fairly popular, largely because a section of the population felt they kind of grew up with her in the war when she did useful things, and therefore they felt she was one of us because she was instrumental in the royals making it to television in the 60s when they were humanized in that way, and then maybe with a little blip in the 90s when it all went a little bit south, particularly when Diana died, but also with Charles and Diana splitting up. Generally speaking, I think the UK as a whole would be pretty keen on the monarchy as long as she was there. Charles, I have to tell you, is not as popular. So a very useful and interesting opinion poll taken there that shows that actually it adds 5 percentage points to the independence vote if you say you're going to be a republic. And we might as well go for that. Let's. I mean, we're not going to say that a vote for independence is a vote for immediately off with their heads or get rid of them in any other way. We'll do it with a referendum. That's the way to be doing these things. And when we're independent, we can have a referendum whenever the hell we like. But let's not pussyfoot about it this time. Let's make a republic part of the Scotland that we're trying to sell to people, I would say.
No, thank you, William. Hugh, can I bring you in?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think we forget sometimes that a lot of the support for the royal family come through the armed forces. In Wales, we've always high percentage of people who've served in the armed forces. You know, Wales, especially the industrial part of Wales, have been strong recruiting grounds for the armed forces. And I think in the 2021 census, it was just under 10% of all Welsh households had somebody who had served in it. So, it's a very big percentage. And I think a lot of the support for the royal family comes from there. So again, you'll have people, and I know people who've served who are very pro-independence, but they are royalists because of that connection. So I think we need to, I don't know in Scotland whether there is that level of people who've got a connection with the armed forces. But I think I remember 10% of households, but I think it's actually 1 in 4 people in Wales have a relative who've served. So it's a very, very high percentage.
It would be an interesting question in Scotland to put to veterans for independence. What do they think about this?
It certainly would be, yes. We've certainly, the UK is, I suppose, an outlier now in terms of nations of the world. There's 195 recognised sovereign states, of which 35 of them are monarchies. 7 of them are absolute monarchies and the others are constitutional monarchies, so it's definitely in the minority. And indeed, even the Commonwealth, of which the current monarch is the head of the Commonwealth, the majority of Commonwealth members are republics. So it's not unusual in the world. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's unusual to be a monarchy. So perhaps that's, and I'm sure there will be a demographic factor in these. I haven't seen the breakdown of the opinion polls, but I would have suspected that younger people would be more likely to be.
That's perfectly possible. I haven't seen the figures to absolutely prove it, and sometimes these things can surprise you a little bit. But I would certainly think that one thing we shouldn't underestimate is the ability of the royals to reinvent themselves. And they will be aware that perhaps Charles is not as popular, but of course William is waiting in the wings. And much as I admire the name, I'm not so sure that he's all he's cracked up to be, but certainly he'll be presented as such. And we do have a media that's very, whatever the demographics of that media, very pro-royal. And just today we had, I think, was it Country File on the BBC went to Highgrove, and there's the King. He doesn't actually live there, but that's somebody else. But anyway, he's coming to get some sort of neat little Christmas decoration to put on the tree, and he very graciously puts one on the tree and then leaves it to the others to put all the others on. Speaks to the presenter, Matt Baker, and nobody else, and then basically disappears. But that's the sort of thing you're fed. It's part of the bread and circuses. A right royal approval, seal of approval. And yeah, that's always happening. And that's going to feed into the young just as much as the old, I think.
Yes. Would you like to add anything?
I'm going to come in now. I have actually got the numbers in front of me. Support for the monarchy is highest amongst people over 65, while younger people are far more likely to oppose it. For example, 43% of 18 to 24-year-olds in Great Britain would prefer an elected head of state. So yeah, so as you see, I think it's a generational thing. As you say, I think the Queen was generally popular. I think, the older generation, my mother, for example, she was somebody who admired the Queen. But I don't think you'll find many people now who admire King Charles. And I think, the Queen Camilla isn't very popular. But again, it's just this, as you're saying, it's how it's reported as well. We've been going through a cost of living crisis. The people are struggling to get appointments in hospitals and with GPs. And we're constantly being told that Queen Camilla has had a chest infection and can't attend some outdoor event. And it's madness, in this day and age, that a family who just purely through, blood and, their hereditary history are in a position of incredible power and wealth and have to do very, very little for it. I think one of the things that's impacting as well, I think, although people, I think William is, more popular than his father. I think with younger people, a lot of younger people identify more with Meghan and Harry than they do with the other royals. And then you've got the walking disaster area that is Prince Andrew, who sort of has managed to get the attention of being connected to people like Epstein away from people's gaze by being friends with a Chinese spy. So it's I don't think that's helped in any shape or form.
He's the gift that keeps giving for the Republican fraternity, you've got to say. It would almost be worth keeping him on for the continued popcorn enhancement chances,
Well, I'm sure he's not sweating.
No.
Yes, it's been an interesting year politically. I'm sure next year, 2025, I should say, it will be even more interesting as both our nations, Wales and Scotland, move forward, hopefully politically, and the next electoral contests that will be of interest to ourselves will be in 2026. But of course,
we hope,
yes. But of course, this coming spring, there will be English council elections, which will be a very interesting barometer of what is happening in the grassroots in many parts of England, perhaps in a frightening way. that will amplify the rightward drift of UK politics, which is what I'm witnessing.
Maybe a wake-up call.
Hopefully a wake-up call. Do you have any comments on what might come in the spring with the English Council elections?
When you look at the by-elections that have been since Labour came into power, and there is this, sort of this feeling that Reform, are going to perform incredibly well. They've done actually quite badly. They've literally won a handful of the 170 seats that have been contested. But I think obviously with the local elections, and it depends again, on the media giving attention, and the fact that people like Farage now, million followers on TikTok, they have their own platforms, and I think this is the big thing is, the platforms like the BBC are and newspapers are becoming more and more irrelevant. We saw in the United States how Joe Rogan's podcast was hugely influential, especially with younger people, and I think that's what we need to look at. And I think we need to get people to realise the value of independent news outlets like Broadcast Scotland and like Talking Wales that's being developed down here. And I think that's the key thing is we need better media, and not media that looks at things from one perspective, something that is objective and can actually present people with facts and information in a way that they can understand and relate to.
Oh, thanks very much. Do you have any final remarks?
Council elections. My big concern for the English Council elections is turnout, because you could get all sorts of skewed results because of low turnout, and low turnout is what you will get because people are cheesed off with politicians, and if anybody turns out to vote, it will be the Reform voters, because they'll be the ones who are punishing the established parties. But things could be decided on quite low turnouts. And some of the by-election, and I stress they are by-election turnouts in Scotland, have been appalling. And I don't expect much better in England.
Well, with that cheery note, that brings us to it for this week's Full Scottish. But before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated, and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We set our current fundraising target in April, hoping to reach 36,000 by the end of this year. It is now December and we have raised almost 20,000, just half of our target. However, to pay our bills and survive, we urgently need to raise at least 12,000. We have borrowed 12,000 to enable us to survive for now, but the pressure is still on and we do need to find enough regular donors to give us financial security. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around 2,500. We need more regular subscribers, but we need to clear our debts as well. We are at crisis point and really need to increase our donations to be able to survive, to pay our bills. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you to my guest William and to Hugh. Thank you for everyone watching. Goodbye. See you in the new year.